Thank you so much. Yeah, the times are on in my head. That's okay. But yes, we have the 20 block of time, so it's not like we have a specific, time frame that each person has to speak at or for. It's just we'll speak all in a row.
I can wait against my slide. It's one of those I prefer to pull it when they're
Oh, yeah, we can.
If she wants to just connect her to the other.
She's going to flip a website to share.
Okay.
Do you have a presentation as well?
I do. It's just 3 slides. They were kind of like, pretty sure this is it. So,
Yeah.
Because at least for one night, it's just kind of show up.
So you'll switch back and forth between slides and the internet. Okay.
So for most of the presentations I have it on, so for yours, I'll swap back to people.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and she's gonna be our class speaker, so and then we'll switch off the panel. So it'll be easy. Yeah, because they don't speak until the mic and the people. Okay. So yeah, we'll have to make sure we do that.
It's like that.
So when you're presenting, you'll speak into that one. When we're paneling, you'll be these.
And I guess
Exactly. You do like an interpretive dance to show the words.
Right. Okay.
Highly encouraged, actually.
Highly encouraged, yeah. So I don't need to update like anything presentation wise, but when they set stuff out, I'm gonna send it out. Here, I'm not sure.
That's a good one.
I'll just send her.
Oh, actually, yes. Here she is.
Hey, I just realized I should probably add a URL to this. Oh, okay, yeah. Or you, and I fills out my budget. If I update it on the drive, then just press this, that would come on the drive. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I have not. Great. Yeah, that doesn't
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I assume this is already working. Good morning, everyone. So welcome to our panel discussion on data visualization tools. My name is Christyn Fertenbaugh, and I'm going to be both the moderator and your first speaker today. So I have some wonderful folks here to talk about some really great topics. We're going to cover a little bit of a gamut of topics here, but they're all sort of related. So that's why we put them together into this discussion. One thing I wanted to note up front is that we're all going to speak first, and then you'll have time for questions at the end. So if you have a question for a specific speaker or about a specific topic, please just note it down or just keep it in your head until the end. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions. If you're looking at the agenda, it says timing for each speaker. We're not necessarily following timing. So just if you're one of those people that likes to follow timing, we're not necessarily doing that. We're just going to make sure that we have time at the end for questions. So each speaker will have up to 15 minutes, but not necessarily will speak for exactly 15 minutes. With that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to talk about as part of this discussion is the Viable Utility Reserve and our GIS mapping efforts. So if you were in the lightning talks at the end of the day yesterday, some of this you'll hear again, but I want to make sure that if anyone missed yesterday, that we're all on the same page before we start talking about that map. What on earth was that? Yeah, I guess so. Yes, I didn't know I was going to get like a drum roll in. So like I said, my name is Christyn. I'm with the Viable Utility Reserve in the Division of Water Infrastructure. I've previously bounced around between drinking water and wastewater and have finally landed in the funding program. So this is a really great spot for me because the Viable Utility Reserve does both water and wastewater. So it's a really great fit for me. So I'm going to cover a little bit of the background. I mentioned this before. This is going to be a little bit repeated from yesterday. So if you were here at the lightning talks, this will be repeated. And then I'm going to go into our GIS mapping efforts. So to give some background on the Viable Utility Reserve, we're a brand new program. We're less than 2 years old. We were signed into law back in July of 2020. And basically what this program is intended to do is foster the viability of water and wastewater systems across the state by a number of different steps. The first one is identifying and designating certain systems as distressed. We wanted to provide a process by which they can become viable, so no longer being distressed. So not just saying you're distressed, good luck, but actually creating a process to really build them up and get them into viability. And lastly, the biggest part of this is that it does have joint buy-in and approval from both the State Water Infrastructure Authority and the Local Government Commission. So there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of folks involved. It's not just the Division of Water Infrastructure. We have a lot of buy-in from these other groups as well that have a stake in these utilities becoming viable. Our initial funding was $9 million non-recurring. That's just how much they gave us when they signed us into law. But then we now also have ARPA funding available, which is a lot of money. So if you were here yesterday, you know how much that is. It's many millions of dollars. But if you have questions about ARPA funding and how that affects the Viable Utility Reserve, please just come find me and ask me. I'll be here the rest of the day. So as far as the distress criteria go, this is how this relates to our GIS mapping. So there's 4 different ways that a system could become designated as distressed. The first one is that the LGC, the Local Government Commission, has assumed fiscal control of the water and wastewater system. So that is a pretty big step for them to take. I think they currently have 7 under their fiscal control, but please don't quote me on that. So that's a pretty big step. So that's the first criteria. The second criteria is if they have not submitted audits for the past 2 years. So they do have to submit audits to the LGC on an annual basis. So if they've missed that 2 years in a row, that is a criteria for being designated. The third criteria is the way by which most systems are designated as distressed, and that's using our assessment criteria. So we use the word criteria in 2 different ways. So if you get a little bit lost, it happens. Still happens to me. But we have 20 criteria by which we score these systems, and that's a combination of financial and compliance indicators. If you're curious about a list of the indicators, it is available on our website. If you search NC Viable Utility Reserve in any search browser, you can find our website, and there's a lot of little information about what those criteria are, what they mean, who is scored how, and all of that information is available. I'm not going to go into that in abundant detail here today. The important thing to note is that there are certain thresholds that have been set for how we designate them based on that score. If they have a score of 9 or above and they have both water and wastewater at their system, that means that they're qualified to be designated as distressed. If they have a score of 8 and have either water or wastewater, so not both, then that would also qualify them for being designated as distressed. The last criteria is criteria 4. This is sort of the catch-all criteria. Other information is available. And the actual description of it is much longer, but it's basically any other information outside of the existing criteria that determines that a system is not viable or should be just designated as distressed. So we haven't actually used criteria 4 yet. We're in the process of developing a system by which we can consistently gather information and have them submit documentation. But we're still working on that because we're still a brand new program. We're not even 2 years old yet. So once you become designated as distressed, it's not just you're designated and that's it. I mentioned that we have this process in place by which we want to foster viability of these systems. So the way we're doing this is we're providing both initial and continuing education. So this isn't just technical education for their operators. This is financial education, managerial education, operational education, as well as all the infrastructure stuff. So we want to make sure that they are getting the information they need, because a lot of these systems, you have your operator that knows how to work the system, and you have the board that, approves the budget and whatnot, but they don't necessarily always talk. And so we want to make sure that everyone's on the same page in order to make sure that the system is moving forwards in the best possible way. The other requirements is that we want them to either have done recently or complete studies. These include asset inventory assessments, which are basically looking at their system. What do they have? Where is it? How old is it? What condition it's in? How critical it is in terms of either what it serves, like a hospital, or in terms of, well, if this line has a break, the whole system is down. We want them to look at merger and regionalization feasibility studies. So that could be looking at a neighboring utility. Maybe they want to have an interconnection so that they have better resiliency. Maybe, you know, they're just tired of having their own water or wastewater system and they want the next system over to take them over. It could also look at options like decentralization. So maybe they're so small that it makes more sense to have a couple different treatment plants as opposed to having one big one for financial operations standpoint. So the last thing we want them to look at for studies is a rate study. We want to make sure that they're looking at their rates. How are they setting their rates? How often are they adjusting their rates? Do their rates compensate for their infrastructure needs? Are they relying on, you know, other funding sources to kind of keep themselves going, which is not good. You know, you want to be self-supporting essentially as an enterprise. And then the last part of the requirements that we have are action plans. So we do require that they form a short-term action plan, a long-term action plan, and a long-term financial management plan. So that not only do they do all these things kind of right now, but that they have a plan going forward so that they can follow to keep their viability going into the future. Because it's great if we fix everything now, but if they don't have the capacity to maintain it in 20 years, it's not going to be good anymore. So to move into our mapping, so we've got a lot of questions on a daily basis. Who's designated? What's their score? Do they have water? Do they have wastewater? How do I find out who to contact in the division of water infrastructure? How do I figure out what regional office they're in? So we wanted to create a map, and we're in the process of putting this on our website, so it's not live yet. But I wanted to talk about it to kind of show you where we're going and what kind of information we're sharing. So another question that we get is, well, where are these distressed utilities? Are they on the east side? Are they on the west side of the state? Are they everywhere? And so we also wanted to make sure that it was a GIS map as opposed to just kind of a list of information. So that way people can see all of the data that we're trying to share. So this is what the map looks like. It's pretty simple. It's just a bunch of dots on a map. And it's color coded. So the dark blue is distressed. The light blue is not distressed. Something that's important to note is that because of the way the different criteria work, the score does not always correlate to their distress status. So their score might be 4 on that assessment criteria under number 3, but if they haven't submitted their audits for the past 2 years, they might still be designated. So we put in a basic legend to just show distressed or not distressed, and it does not correlate to the score. So that's important to note. For most systems, it does, but for some, it does not. So that's really important to know. We also separated everything by council of government. We have a lot of our COGs involved in some of these utility efforts. And so we wanted to make sure that we show the COG on that map so that people could see who they might be able to go to more locally for assistance or guidance before they come to the Division of Water Infrastructure. Or maybe they want to talk to their local person instead of the Division of Water Infrastructure, which is totally fine as long as they eventually make it up to us. The other important thing about the COGs is that we have separated the state through project managers by COG. So I have assigned 5 COGs. So those are who would contact me if they have questions about funding, and that's whose projects I manage. So when you click on any little dot on this map, there's a series of 3 pop-ups that come up, and you can navigate using the little arrows left and right. The first one, now I say the first one, they don't always pop up in the same order. I don't know why. It's a GIS thing. So the first one that popped up when I clicked on this one was the regional office. So this gives you basic information about which regional office they're in, a phone number that they could call if they have regional office questions about maybe compliance issues, maybe they have an inspection question, where that office is, if they need to mail something, or if they want to go have a meeting, and then who the contact is for both public water and wastewater. So I thought that was very important because we do get some questions where they say, well, you know, the regional office hasn't been out in a couple of years. I don't remember who to call. Right here, we can give them the phone number, we can give them the supervisor name, and then they can get the information that they need. The next little pop-up that comes up is the scoring information and the block that tells you whether they have drinking water, wastewater, or both. So in this case, this is East Bend. They have a total score of 9. They are designated as distressed. You can see it's a little bit darker blue. And they do have both drinking water and wastewater. So it's just kind of basic information, but we are hoping that it will head off a lot of the questions that we get kind of almost on a daily basis. The last block is kind of the most important one, and that's who you should contact in DWI if you are this entity or if you are in this COG. So we do have them assigned out by COG. So this one is in the Piedmont Triad Regional Council, and Susan is our contact for that COG. And so if they click on all of these little click boxes, they can get a lot of information about who they can contact with any sorts of questions about their compliance issues, about the viable utility reserve. We can also help with any other DWI questions. So, if they contact me and they say, well, I have an SRF loan, what do I do with this? Or I have a question about it. I can either answer that question or I can get them in contact with who it is. So the goal with this was not to be completely comprehensive and show every piece of information, like their whole score and all the scoring criteria and how they got points where and so on and so forth. The goal is to give them the basic information so that they can reach out to who can get them all of that information. We do also have an internal dashboard that is much more detailed. So if someone does call me, like say if East Bend can't get a hold of Susan and they decide to call me instead because they find my name on the website or they heard my name somewhere, they can call me and I can pull up our internal dashboard and that has all of the scoring information, everything on there. So I can pull it up at a glance. And these two maps are tied together. We're just not showing all that information here. So something I wanted to mention about the scores, and this is also why we're getting a lot of questions now, is that the at-risk category for ARPA funding is also partially affected by their score under these criteria. So we are getting some questions about, well, am I distressed? Am I at risk? Am I qualified for this? So we're hoping that this map will also help address some of these questions about the assessment score for the at-risk category. So with that, this is my contact information. You can also, into any search bar, look for NC Viable Utility Reserve, and you can come up with all of our contact information. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to our next panelist, Klaus Albertin, who's going to be talking about system boundary mapping.
All right, thanks, Christyn. So I'm Klaus Albertin. I'm with the Water Supply Planning Branch within DWR, and I'm going to talk about water service area boundaries, something I hadn't really spent much thought on till a couple of years ago, but has been really interesting to kind of dig into. So when I talk about water service boundaries, Christyn talked about the locations, these kind of spots in the state where the systems are. I'm talking about the actual physical extent of where a town or a utility provides water service to. A lot of different uses for it. Just to understand how much of a population is actually served by municipal water. What the potentials for interconnections are, either for emergencies, line breaks, things like that, for additional supply, especially during drought conditions. And then analyzing sorts of things that maybe like Renee is going to talk about, what is the burden on a population? How big an area do they have to serve? Obviously, really urban areas have a lot more density, a lot shorter lines per population, a lot less O&M for that sort of thing. More rural areas are going to have much bigger areas for that same, population. So it's more of a burden on areas if they have a bigger service. And then finally, identifying underserved communities. So a lot of different interests, kind of reside with knowing what the service area boundary is. The interesting thing is there is no regulatory requirements for providing a service area boundary to the state. So there's not a good data set in existence for where specific systems, do provide water. Places like Cary, Charlotte, Raleigh, they have a GIS department. They have asset management. They know exactly where their meters, where the extent is. Smaller towns may not. A lot of times the maps that they have were created in the 30s, not 30s, sometimes maybe in the 30s, but more, created 30, 40 years ago. They've got a paper map, and that's it. It hasn't been updated since then. A lot of the smaller systems don't have anybody with GIS capacity. If they have any sort of GIS, it was something done by a consultant. So, they just don't have that technical capacity to provide GIS maps. Changing workforce. A lot of systems, kind of relied on the utility director, the people that had been there for 20, 30 years. They knew that, the water lines went out to, this address, and beyond that, it was well water. Those folks are retiring. You have new people coming in just with no institutional knowledge. So a lot of that is being lost, and it needs to get into a GIS so that, it isn't lost completely. One of the challenges I'll talk about in a minute is what level of detail. For some things, you just want to know how big an area does a system cover, what the population is. Other sorts of analyses, you want to get into not just, what is the external boundary, but are there pockets within that, so that are there populations that maybe within a town, but they don't actually have water service from the town, and that does happen. Kind of an issue that we have with the GIS is a county may say, well, we cover all this area, but then within that, a town or utility may say, well, we cover that. So you get a lot of these places where two systems, adjoin, but really they're showing an overlap. So it's hard to say, is it the county? Is it this municipality? Is it this utility? And then security considerations. A lot of times when we talk about getting into more detailed maps, the systems don't like it because they see it as a security concern. They don't want to let anybody know where their water lines are, where their manholes, intakes, that sort of thing, where those actually are. So it's just one of these considerations. Again, a lot of issues have come up. It seemed like an easy sort of thing. I mean, I just assumed that there would be a great database and people would know exactly where the service boundaries were. And as we get more into it, it's like there's just a lot of things to consider. This is just an example of what we have in GIS right now. You can see that blue dot. That's what one system said was their service area boundary. Obviously, it's more just a jurisdictional boundary. It's 1 mile from town hall. That's not actually where they provide water to. That's just where they have their municipal jurisdiction. Another system has just that kind of external boundary, which is great for doing calculations like what is the miles of pipe per person. And it does get away from that security concern because you don't know where the lines and the hydrants are. And then the blue that has a lot of, cutouts in it, that's the more detailed level. But then you start to get into the security issues. And you're also, if you try and do a calculation of miles per population, the blue is going to show a lot less area than that kind of orangish brown. So it's tough to do the same sort of calculation because you're not comparing exactly the same type of area. So those are a lot of the issues, concerns that we've come up with. Duke University contacted us about 3 years ago and said, can we have all the maps that you have? So within the local water supply planning branch, when systems have to develop their local water supply plans, we ask for the maps. Now, they don't have to give it to us. And different systems give us different information. Some gave us that dot, some actually, about less than 5% actually gave us a GIS of the surface area boundaries. But a lot were JPEGs of maps that were created 30 years ago. So anyways, Duke said, can we have your maps? We want to come up with a statewide coverage. We said, sure, here you go. And again, it went from GIS all the way down to hand-drawn maps and a picture of that hand-drawn map. So I think they kind of got more than they were expecting. I think they hoped that we would have a nice starting point. So they really learned a lot about all the different GIS techniques that you need to do to georeference and convert from PDF into, you know, a layer. Yeah, so anyways, they got all the maps that we had, which was probably 90% of the systems in the state. They converted those from JPEGs, PDFs, whatever we had, georeferenced them, and then gave it back to us. And they, you know, they spent a lot of work on it, and it was a great starting point. But there are still some of those issues I talked about with overlaps. You know, some systems said we cover the whole thing, when really they only cover part of the county. You know, there's a lot of areas that they just don't serve. You know, they could, but they don't. And then there's other areas where, you know, one system overlaps. So different systems saying they have they actually provide the service, and we don't really know which one it is. And kind of to clean all that up is a huge amount of work, a lot of labor hours, even with GIS, that's going to go into it. So kind of where we're going from that, with that layer that Duke created, we've been talking with Division of Water Infrastructure, saying, well, as systems get grants, can you ask them, can you require them to come up with a good map of their service area boundary? It's probably not a big effort if they're getting $7 million just to say, you know, what's the extent? And then we're also working with DOT. They've got this Atlas project that they're working on to kind of understand where facilities exist. So when they're building, you know, what may be impacted, and also where they want to put in roads. So it's this Atlas project. They've been working on sewer sheds, and they're interested in getting the water service batteries in there too. So just a couple ways that we're going to try and tackle that big effort next. That was it. So I will wait for questions.
All right, so next I'd like to introduce Renee Kramer, who's going to be talking about environmental justice, and we'll get her presentation set up in just a moment.
Hi, okay, thank you. So now that I saw their presentations, I really wish I saw those before, because I would have added a few different things on my slides, but that's totally fine. I'm going to try and say them anyways, but I might be missing a few of the details because I don't really have a detailed oriented memory, but that's fine. We're going to get you that information one way or the other. So Renee Kramer, I am DEQ's Title VI and Environmental Justice Coordinator. I'm going to talk a little bit about not super background, but just like what is environmental justice, so we can all kind of be on the same page, and then talk about a lot of our mapping efforts, because really environmental justice would not be where it is today if it were not for the advancements in our mapping tools and the data that we have all been kind of trying to overlay with environmental justice and let me rephrase that, with like demographic data, socioeconomic data, and environmental data. So what is environmental justice? The US EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So North Carolina DEQ has adopted that same definition for our program, as well as like what is environmental justice. So we look at the criteria below for these sort of overlays. We do a lot of EJ reports with all of these data sets. The big ones that you'll see that are in the environmental justice definition are going to be the race and ethnicity and the poverty or household income. We actually use poverty for our state definition of underserved populations. I'll talk about that later. But then you'll see the bottom is some thresholds that are a little bit more broad than the underserved populations layer you'll see in a little bit. But basically the concept is the same, is that we are comparing one smaller geographic unit to a larger geographic area. And so in this one, it's the 10% in comparison to the county or state average actually, and then 5% or more in comparison to the state or county average for poverty, and then just a blanket 50% or more for minority status. And you'll kind of see these same themes in a little bit. But to break that down a little bit more, there are lots of types of justice that you can think of. The big one with mapping that we're considering is that top piece of distributional justice of the geographic distribution of your environmental benefits versus your environmental burdens. So I think that's just a really key piece. You'll see all three of these concepts within that definition of environmental justice with the meaningful involvement, equal protection from rulemaking and enforcement kind of thing. But really today, going to focus on that distributional justice. It's kind of what a lot of people think of first when they think of environmental justice as well. So one other level setting, this is just another example of the importance of the geographic considerations of how we got to where we are today. From 1934 to 1968 until the Fair Housing Act was passed, there was a common practice called redlining that was done by governments. And so you'll see on the bottom, actually, the University of Richmond is working on kind of similar to what the last speaker was just talking about, that they used to be in just PDFs or just on paper. And so they've actually been working to integrate this into GIS to help overlay this as another consideration of looking at issues today versus historically how our cities were kind of set up. And so just two other pieces on that. Well, one, the importance of mapping. Two, that race was a critical part of the planning of cities at this time. And three, that environmental influences like transportation corridors and industrial plants were considered a detrimental influence, AKA environmental burden, that people did not want to live near. So just kind of another thing to keep in mind as we're talking about environmental justice. So DEQ has come up with a definition called the potentially underserved communities layer, and the definition is down there. It's pretty tiny, so apologies for that. But basically, it is comparing the census block group level for racial composition and poverty rate to county and state levels. And so it's going to be that 10% difference for race and ethnicity, either compared to the county or the state, or 50% minority or people of color status in general would be flagged, as well as poverty status greater than 5% of the block group greater than 20% total, or a 5% or greater difference when compared to the county or state. And so this is about 25% of our state's census block groups. And what we've been doing is overlaying this with division and program data. So this is an example actually of the pre-regulatory landfill program. We have been overlaying both of the last two presenters, the distressed utilities. We've been doing principal loan forgiveness. We did water boundaries for service areas. But again, you can see kind of how that issue, there's a lot of issues with that. So it's not super clean at this point, but these are just kind of things that we're working towards to see where we can improve and do better. The other thing I want to say about this is we've mentioned the ARP funding. Hopefully everybody has heard of the Justice 40 initiative. Again, wish I had that executive order number, but some executive order that was signed in the last 2 years by President Biden directs that 40% of all benefits flow to disadvantaged, underserved communities. And so we have been working with Division of Water Infrastructure a lot over the past several months to see how we can implement this. And one of the ways is through if 75% of the overall benefits go to a potentially underserved community or tribal area, I'll show you what this looks like in our mapping system, because this is just a printed version of the potentially underserved communities, but that 75% of those benefits go to those communities, or to have kind of a catch-all, because mapping does not really, it's not like the end all be all. There are definitely more granular, smaller communities that get missed from these underserved block groups. For example, I was just working with the community in Alcoa Baden down by Baden Lake, and West Baden is a historically Black community. They are not captured in our underserved community map. So just one example of how sometimes a community is smaller than the level of data that doesn't actually get captured. So to have that catch-all, we do have some language in there that says a community can give a narrative of why they believe that they are actually an underserved community, even if they're not on the mapping, to try and make sure we're more inclusive of all the communities in need. So I mentioned the community mapping system. We developed the mapping system back in 2019. We went through a pretty serious long-term stakeholder engagement and development process with academic focus groups, talking with other states. More and more states are having developing mapping systems, and now we are getting inquiries about what we did and how we developed ours. We had public meetings, smaller calls with organizations, and we have a website and survey. So when we were developing it, this is kind of interesting. It kind of is the difference between our potentially underserved communities map and the mapping system, because we have to work with the way that the data is for like socio-demographic data. So that's the smallest level that we can get that on, is the block group level. But we also, like, I don't know what block group I live in. Does anybody here know the number that you like? Probably not. So that's not really a user-friendly thing. So when we were developing the mapping system, we were like, let's let the user define their own community and kind of aggregate all of the data. When I'll show it in a second, but when you are looking at a mapping extent, it's like averaging your data so you can kind of zoom in or out and pull in more or less data depending on, you know, where you go to school, where you go to work, what you're interested in. So letting the user define their community, developed this interactive system. So it wasn't just like for example, the potentially underserved communities map is not very super interactive, right? It's like, here you can give someone a printed out version of it, and you can see yes or no, does it fall into the system? So different in that sense. Ensuring the data is up to date is also super important, because once your data gets out of date, then it's not really super helpful. And then finally, we wanted to show DEQ relevant data as well. So this is our website for the community mapping system, has a lot of stuff. I think what I'll point out here is really the glossary of terms. That document has the list of every single data set that is within the mapping system. And really that is some demographic data. There's some health data from DHHS, and then all of the divisions across DEQ, we have pulled all of that data into one place for permits and incidents. And this is something that we had not done previously. It was kind of each division for themselves. So here we have what it looks like today. So we have recently, actually, I think this fall, added that potentially underserved communities layer. So it's that purple layer that you see there. And then the shaded orange areas you can really see down near Robeson County. Of course, there are several other ones, but that's kind of the biggest area of the state designated tribal statistical areas in our state. And so the reason we added these were for funding specifically, for the most part, also to help applicants who are interested in looking at locations for permits to kind of see what that community might look like from a potentially underserved community standpoint, not quite that dynamic. Let me kind of investigate. And so what we've done is, as I mentioned, I think we've now done this for the 319 Impaired Waterway Grant, as well as this DWI infrastructure stuff, really focusing and giving extra points to help try and encourage people who are either benefiting underserved communities or state designated tribal statistical areas, trying to get them to apply and that they would get extra points for that funding. So don't have much time left, just got the 5-minute notification. But here's, if you zoom in, it populates with our permits and incidents from DEQ. So you can see here's just some of what that looks like. You can get specific information on one permit. You can also get, there is an info summary that will actually tell you the number of each type of permit, and it will update as you zoom in or out or pan across. So again, really dynamic updates depending on what area of interest you might have. But then we do have this screening tool where you can select one specific area, draw a radius around it, and then actually print out that report you see at the bottom. You can click report, and then you can print out this info summary and get the total number of these DEQ permits and incidents. There's also some demographic data at the bottom that we've added more recently, but just easy to kind of print out and let a community member take to their local planning section or wherever this might be used. So we also have the EJ tool that you can get to if you just click on a random block group. And again, this is super dynamic. So you see that map extent. If you zoom in or out, the selected area demographics are going to update. And so it's really cool to you can pan across the state and really see how the data differs depending on where you are. And then key theme, comparing one area to a larger area. So we've kept in that statewide demographic comparison at the bottom so that you can kind of see how does this compare. And you can see this as an example of how it compares pretty differently to the statewide demographics. And so those are all of the different data sets that we have in the EJ tool. We also have the health dashboard, which is on the county level just because of data availability. But this is kind of the dynamic version if you're interested in more like what's kind of going on versus like, is this a potentially underserved community or not? Because they both kind of have their benefits, right? Sometimes people are like, this one label, like you miss things. It's not perfect to be like yes or no, in or out. It's more complicated than that. And so having that ability to both say yes or no, but also let's get a little bit more information and kind of dig a little deeper, see how it updates as you move across. So both have their ups and downs. The last thing I'm going to mention is EPA's EJ screen. This is another really great tool. They just recently came out with version 2.0, and we developed our mapping system to kind of not mirror, I don't know, be friends with, that's not the right word either, but whatever, complement, that's the word, complement this, hopefully they're friends too, but to complement this. And so if you print out that permit and info summary that we have, and then you also print out this demographic report, then you can kind of really get an idea of like a radius setting that's even smaller than that block group or census tract level data that we have. So just some other mapping tools that we have. But again, we're really trying to work with that potentially underserved community layer, working with the other people that have spoken today about overlaying, trying to get more access for underserved communities to water infrastructure needs, grant opportunities, things like that. So that's all for me.
All right, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Julia Cavalier with the Environmental Finance Center, and she's going to be talking about some of their data visualization tools.
Good morning. So I am, whoops. I'm a former colleague of a couple of people behind the desk over here. My name is Julia Cavalier. I have worked with the Environmental Finance Center since 2019. Before that, I worked for the public water supply section and did lots of data stuff, official term there. I decided I was, I was responsible for a big database project, and then decided I wanted to go back to school to do more of that. I graduated in May of 2020. It was a time. I graduated though, like going from the ruthless time management of I'm writing my paper on the bus to, oh my God, I'm home and I have to do this stuff from home was something. But I wound up working or continuing to work at the Environmental Finance Center. My unofficial job title is Data Queen. My now official job title is Research Director. The Environmental Finance Center, I'm pulling up our website at the moment because I want to go to the web-based version of a particular tool. Our most kind of known public-facing product, as I'm pulling up a couple things here. Oh, sorry. I did something wrong. See, never trust someone from a university, right? So our kind of most known product is the water and wastewater rates dashboards, which have been going since 2009, 2012, quite a while. And there is a lot of data combined here. So annually for North Carolina and periodically for other states, we do surveys to collect water and wastewater rates. We combine that data with a lot of data coming from other sources like the census and from the Public Water Supply Database, CIDWIS. And really, there's a lot going on here. When I was first hired, I was responsible for a major update on these dashboards. Since that time, we have really been focusing on streamlining a lot of our data, making it user-friendly. I have been introduced to the term big, ugly spreadsheet. And that was, there are certainly some products, right, that are built on a spreadsheet platform, and they work. But there's limitations in how people can use that, right? If you're busy, you're doing your job, learning some new thing and punching in a whole bunch of numbers is just not something a lot of people want to spend time doing. What we have been focusing on is streamlining this data, and whoa, this one does not feel like zooming in for me. Let's see what, okay, cool. There we go. Streamlining this data. This is the affordability assessment tool. We set about converting a spreadsheet-based product to a Tableau-based product. And this is, I'm showing you Tableau reports today, right? There are different platforms out there that you might use Power BI, you might use other things. They kind of work similarly, but the real power comes when you have a database behind them and when you have connected those pieces of data so you can use them and more quickly do things with it. The flip side of it, that I spend a lot of time saying is, don't just collect something because you can, because then guess what? You have to maintain it. If you go through a lot of effort to collect something this year, if you want to keep using it, then you need to keep updating it and correcting. So our focus in this affordability assessment tool was taking something that was spreadsheet based that basically gave you these instructions of go look up your data on the census data tracker and find these numbers and enter these numbers in, right? That's a lot of steps. We have data running behind the scenes. The census has APIs to supply their data out there for the public. And what we have done is we've got this cascading filters where first you can select a state. This is a nationwide visualization tool. Then you can zoom in. So when I select Wilson County, I then go in and I'm not the best person when it comes to the census definitions. I believe these are census places. I always get the words wrong. But you can select a specific location. In this case, I went to Wilson County. I'm going to select Wilson City. And you can enter some numbers to do with, it suggests a monthly residential charge in terms of what does it look like today? What are you considering for the future? Honestly, these are buckets, so you can put whatever numbers you like in there. If you're thinking about changing commercial rates, you could put in, what is somebody going to pay at 15,000 gallons a month? But if I were to contemplate, say right now, someone's paying $40 a month, and I'm considering increasing the rate to $42.50 a month. I can go to the next page and so this, I should probably zoom out a little bit. Hold on a second. All right. So this summarizes different pieces of information. So in the water, wastewater rate setting arena, a lot of people use MHI as their guideline for what is affordable and what is not affordable. I think there is a state specific number, but other states as well. The breakpoint tends to be, are you paying 2% or more of median household income? Now that's right. There's a lot more numbers you could be looking at. The idea here with these different charts is we're providing multiple measures in comparison with state values. So things like, it's not just median household income, but households below the poverty level, unemployed. And beneath this, there's some red, hold on, I got to zoom out further. There's some red flagging saying, hey, your MHI is below the state level. Your poverty rate is above the state level. Giving you information in context. This is not going to tell you what should your rates be, right? This is going to tell you when you're putting in a specific dollar amount, how's that going to impact your community on average. Then if you go on the assessment screen, there's a chart. Let me zoom out or zoom a little bit here. A chart that lets you say for all households or for owner-only households, how much of your population is in these lowest 3 income buckets. If I switch this toggle from all to owner, you will see that kind of semi-transparent green thing is basically telling you how many people are in each of these buckets. If I switch back and forth between all to owner, you're basically saying when you look at homeowners, more of your homeowners have higher incomes. The amount people spend on water right? These bottom 3 red bars are fixed because it's, based, what are these population groups? But based on the 2 different numbers you put in, the first one I started, I think was, what was it? $40. And then the next one was $42.50, right? So you go from the people in this very lowest income bracket at $40, we're paying 4.8% of their annual income towards water. And then when you increase it, they're now paying 5.1% of their annual income. There's a lot of different factors to setting rates, right? So this is one way to give you a perspective. In the version of the slides that's going to send out, I have a link to that tool. And, I would definitely encourage anyone to take a look. If you have questions, please email us. All right. Yeah, resume slideshow. Okay. So, otherwise, I have a couple more slides in here, and I know at this point, they're pretty much meant to be pretty pictures of some stuff we are in the middle of working on. This particular financial benchmarks dashboard, we have done a process for some of the work we are doing for the viable utility reserve of interviewing staff and interviewing utilities and finding out what are the most important financial metrics to understand the strength and financial sustainability of your system. So those metrics that people have cited over and over again have been cost recovery, operating ratio, days cash on hand. And those are basically different ways of slicing and dicing, right? And saying, how much money do you have coming in to pay your bills? This map is another way of presenting that information, where we showed statewide what is the cost recovery of different utilities. These are, we just sliced at here's the recommended amount. Are you below this or are you above this? And it shows further down on the chart, it shows the distribution of those measures for different size utilities, for different size water systems or wastewater systems. It's often harder for smaller utilities to take in enough income to pay their bills, right? Or that taking in enough income to pay the fixed costs they have would mean raising the rates higher for their smaller customer base. Okay. See, I had 3 slides, and how was I able to talk this long? For their smaller customer base, where if you're thinking about larger cities, Raleigh, Charlotte, they have a larger population to spread this over, and economies of scale, right? That comes up a lot. One thing we have done in many of these tools is we have used that same geographic selection option, where we, in this image, it's a little small, but we can again select a county, see which utilities are shown in that county, and then you can decide who do you want to zoom in and see more information on. This one happened to be Fuquay-Varina. And we're really using that interview process and using that understanding of how people want to access their data to prioritize what gets top billing. And I always encourage simpler. I always encourage editing. And then there's another push for, but we should look at this. This would be cool. You know, so there's different things to consider. That's what I have in terms of slides. I do want to share a little bit of a funny. So I have been on a bunch of meetings lately, including with Christyn's boss, and some other people from DEQ. And we're talking a lot about donut holes, right? We're talking a lot about these areas either within municipalities or around the edges of municipalities that don't have water and sewer service. And it's really complicated. We saw some examples, right, of how that reflects past decisions. And, you know, so we've been talking in staff meetings about donut holes. My daughter heard some of this. She's like, you know what? Donut holes sound like they taste good. Water and sewer just doesn't. So with that, I guess we're slipping to the question part. So thank you.
All right, so we have plenty of time for questions, and hopefully you guys have a lot of questions because we've covered a whole gamut of topics and information here, and not in a lot of detail in some cases because there's just too much for, you know, a few minutes. So if you do have a question, if you would please either come to the microphone, or if you don't want to come to the microphone, if you'll just raise your hand, I will bring a microphone to you. That would be great, but we do have about 20 minutes, so we've got lots of time.
This is on environmental justice. Renee, thank you for your talk. And I have two questions. One is, I live in Asheville, and we've done climate risk and climate vulnerability mapping, and I'm wondering to what extent that's happening and interfacing with your BJ tools. And the second question is about process justice, and I'm wondering the extent to which someone is building capacity for people to use these tools to make them effective in their own communities. Thank you.
Hello. I don't think it's on. Yeah, hello. No.
Okay. Anyways, well, I'll just pretend like it's working. But okay, so the first question, yes. So Asheville has done a really cool job with that tool. I've kind of kept tabs on that. As far as interfacing with our tool, they really haven't too much. We've been talking a lot with like NCORE, I'm gonna not remember, North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resilience. There we go. Thanks. And kind of how the mapping system can maybe improve for the future. There's also this blueprint flooding that the legislature has mandated us to do on a statewide basis. So there's like a lot of conversations right now about how to do that, I guess is what I would say. But as far as what has happened so far, not very much. So there's definitely a lot more room for those conversations, and it might be great to kind of connect about what you guys have seen in Asheville and maybe some advice for us as we're kind of trying to do this blueprint across the whole state and some of that interface. So not really yet, in conversation, lots of potential for the first question. Second question.
About process justice, building capacity for using your tools.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. So we've done a lot of, in the past, I guess we haven't done as much super recently. More recently, actually, we've been focusing on kind of the industry side and building their capacity and understanding of environmental justice in general, as well as like how to use our mapping tools. But we have done a lot of like community outreach and working with organizations to try and help their communities in these, using these mapping tools where possible. Obviously, internet access is also an issue, which kind of limits your participation across the board to a lot of these resources. But we have worked with community members and community groups on these mapping tools. And then I guess the second piece of that is kind of like the flip side of, we're still trying to like hear more from the communities about what all their needs are. And when like kind of that self-identification piece of like, if you're not on, like a lot of communities don't really need the underserved communities piece of the mapping. That's kind of more for like the government and us, that what I guess actually don't know what anybody else in this room does, but kind of more for like us and what we're trying to do, because the community doesn't need to be told that they're underserved or disadvantaged, right? Like they're going to tell you that. So we definitely are working with communities, I guess, but yeah, it's kind of complicated. Yes. I don't think this is working still. You think it's working? Is it for the Zoom people? Okay.
So I have a question about the viable utilities reserve. So I know with you're saying that started 2 years ago, but then we have this ARPA money, and I know there's kind of a time limit on that. With the viable utilities, is there going to be a time limit? Is something going to live on beyond these initial influxes of money? Do you have an understanding of, if folks aren't ready now, are there going to be future opportunities?
Yeah, so we had the initial investment of $9 million. It was one-time, non-recurring. So initially what we did with that money was we only funded study grants, which are typically significantly less expensive than construction projects, at 100,000, 150,000, something like that. With the influx of the ARPA money, $450 million, we suddenly have a lot of money to do construction projects. But yeah, no, that's a great question. What do we do kind of after that? ARPA money is limited. It has to all be spent by the end of 2026. So that's not a lot of time. That's less than 5 years at this point. And so we also have the bipartisan infrastructure law, that's bill, that's coming after that. We don't know a lot of specifics on that yet, but we are kind of working out what's going to happen with that. So, that's another influx of money that's potentially coming to the viable utility reserve. And then after that, we just don't know. The legislature might decide to give us money. There might be another federal law that gets passed. So, long story short is we know a couple of things that are kind of on their way, but we don't know after that. But ideally, we would be supported going forwards because, we want to be able to continue to support utilities in becoming viable. We don't want to have to say, well, it's the end of the 5 years of the ARPA money, so I guess we can't help you anymore, but something that's important to note is that even though the viable utility reserve is a specific reserve of money in DWI, there are also other programs that they can get money from. So the standard SRF loan process, the state revolving fund process, they're not ineligible for that because they're distressed. There's just better money available while there's this ARPA grant money available. So, there are other options. And in our priority scoring system, being distressed does boost your points. So, distressed communities might be likely to score higher, because they are distressed. Which would mean that they would be higher in the ranking when we're allocating other types of funds. So, yeah, kind of long story short is we don't really know, but we're really hopeful.
Hi, I'm Ellie Cardinal with AECOM. I'm a geologist. And Klaus, I have a question for you. So there's two questions. Is the service line boundary effort focused on municipalities, or is it also private utilities? Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so it really is focused on basically the systems that fall within the local water supply plan. So it's going to be any public utility or the private systems that are over 1,000 connections.
Okay, and I guess this is kind of a comment, but I'm thinking about the lead and copper rule revision and the lead service line inventory, that's going to be a requirement now. And I'm just kind of thinking, how can you or DEQ kind of capitalize on that requirement and get you some of this, data that you're seeking anyway, instead of a duplication of efforts on all these different components. So
Right.
is
No,
that a
that's a great
consideration?
point.
Yeah.
We'll see how that all evolves, but yeah, definitely, if it gets to the point where systems have to
Right,
understand
exactly.
where their lines are and which ones are
Right.
lead and stuff. Yeah, it definitely
It
could
would be
be
a
a
good-
great input.
Yeah, the security concern is of course a thing, and we've put in a couple proposals for this, the LCR at work, and currently there's like the option to just do like a table and be very generic in terms of where lead service lines currently are. But if there's like an incentive for utilities to be like, we can kill all these birds, with one stone, then yeah.
So that ASDWA, Association of State Drinking Water Administrators, had some really good webcasts about the lead and copper rule revisions. I did ask during one of those. There is no requirement in the federal rule
Yeah.
for utilities to submit
Mhm.
anything, right? The requirement in the rule is that they have it, they have the inventory, and that they update it annually. The process of what they submit to the state, if anything, is left up to the state, and is likely to be part of the rule adoption process that public water supply does.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a great point to bring up, and I would really recommend that, Klaus talk to the right people.
Yeah.
It is one of those regulatory things that gets complicated.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions for our wonderful panel? I'm including myself in that.
I'd like to follow up on the first. Can either of you give me a more visual or concrete example of how the mapping process and so forth or tools could fit into the process justice issue?
Oh, did you bring us? You're asking me. Yeah. Or the man. Well, it may be that my ignorance about all the details that are in the environmental justice mapping tools that you've built might not be appropriate. I don't know what's there, so I was just trying to wrap my head around what that means. And but I see that as another layer of environmental justice that needs to be represented. And so recognizing that we've done it, it seems like it would make sense to look at the compounded injustices that are going on, and that would even help us target interventions and assistance and whatever more clearly. Is that relevant? And then we'll follow up here with someone who knows a lot more about the tool.
Yeah, here's an idea of how you would do it.
Yeah, so we also, in our mapping tool and in EPA's EJ screen and in Google Maps per se, you can find what we call sensitive receptors. Those are things like schools, churches. Churches are a really great place to like do outreach a lot, especially in rural communities across North Carolina. So there are definitely like ways like that to get more like discrete data of like where are some specific people you might be able to reach out to. And so I think sensitive receptors are like a good, like that's like a great first step as far as like mapping. The other thing about that with there's like language access is a big issue that often goes kind of undiscussed, but that's also in the mapping tool of if there is what the federal government calls limited English proficiency population. And so that's another way that the mapping tools can really help with like process justice. If you can't understand what's going on, obviously you can't participate in the conversation. And so trying to make sure that we're translating where needed, reaching out to like community centers, libraries, things like that, that might be center of like, if you don't have internet, you're probably more likely to go to the library to do work. So you're more likely to see something posted at the library, right? So kind of thinking along those lines, those are definitely ways that we're using the mapping tools to help with process justice on like more of like a discrete like project basis. That kind of answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Anything else? I think I see one question online. So Renee, could you please provide some examples of how the community mapping system has been applied towards influencing environmental regulation and policy?
Well, that's a doozy. So I think, let me think about this for a second. That's a new question. Great job, whoever asked me that question. So I think that one, it is really powerful that this tool exists, right? Like this was not even a thing that was out there 5 years ago. It wasn't even really discussed at the state government level. And so I think having this there is just powerful in and of itself to kind of get people thinking about it. As far as a discrete specific example, I'm sure there might be one in my head, but it's just not coming. I'm like really thinking big picture right now. So I'm having kind of a hard time thinking exactly like one specific thing, but I think it started a lot of conversations at a lot of levels of government that like, even I'm pretty sure at this point, like the governor is aware of our mapping system. We have a lot of like, we have monthly interstate conversations about different mapping tools at different state levels. And so like big picture, because that's where my head is right now, there is a lot of discussion going on, like kind of in individual places that is really growing, like the EJ movement that kind of like, for example, Governor Cooper signed Executive Order 246 like a month or so ago. That was like really the first executive order that addressed environmental justice and like a cabinet-wide way. And so I think maybe that's an example of like how having tools like this, not necessarily maybe that specific mapping system, but having that and having our EJ program, and we have a public participation plan, like having all these pieces kind of brings more light to this issue, and actually will slowly, like if you slowly move the needle, it will kind of keep moving.
Yeah, and I can kind of expand on that from the funding standpoint. So the at-risk category of ARPA funding. So we have the Viable Utility Reserve, which has the biggest pot of money available. And then the next biggest category is the at-risk funding. So one of the ways that they can qualify is via that assessment score that I mentioned earlier, the LTC indicators. But the other way a specific project could qualify is if at least 75% of the project cost is going to be extending water or sewer service to underserved communities. So, you know, that's kind of it's not directly related to the mapping system again, but it is a way that environmental justice is influencing the way that we handle things and our policies for implementation of the ARPA funding.
One other thing on that, the EPA's justice tool, I think is going to be really important for the IIJ funding if the justice movement. So for the question, like, you're going to expect that, you know, private and public funds are going to be using that tool to target it.
We have a couple minutes left. If there's any other questions. Is everybody just excited to get to lunch? All right. Well, thank you so much to my wonderful panel.
Yeah. I feel like I always present at like 8 a.m. or like right before lunch.